Hello from me, Lazar Hristov. We continue with the next lesson of the CSS course. We are currently on Chapter 7, Positioning Elements. Open the PDF file. In Chapter 8 of the HTML section we briefly looked at block and line elements, and the display property. And now I'll recall them again, but already in the CSS section. As we have already said, according to the way they are arranged in the text flow of the document, elements are divided into two main types, block and inline. By default, the elements on the page are arranged in the same order, that is, in the same sequence, in which they are written in the HTML document, with block elements having the following characteristics: take up the entire width of the row, the next element is placed on the bottom row, that is, one after the other. And inline elements have a width according to their content and are placed next to each other. This order of arrangement is called the normal flow, the general flow, or simply the document flow. Furthermore, there are differences between block and line elements in the properties that can be applied to them. Line elements ignore width and height properties, top and bottom margins indent, and can be aligned vertically, via the vertical align property, where of course this can be used, it's not for all cases. Block elements stretch height to fit their content, can have width and all padding properties applied to them, cannot be vertically aligned. Display property. Most elements in CSS are classified as either block or inline, which also determines how they will be displayed by default on web pages. Sometimes we may need to change the way a given element is displayed. For this purpose the display property is used, and its main values are block, the element is displayed as a block. Inline, displays as inline block, mixed version. And in CSS3 there are new values for this, but they will be the subject of a separate chapter in the CSS section. It's about CSS. Grid layout, the newest, and CSS Flexbox, these are new elements, but we'll examine them in Chapter 30, which is part of the paid course. By default, in every block element the display property has the value block, and in every inline element, the value inline, and when we want to change this, we write a new CSS declaration. Here's an example of that. And here's what we'll see in the browser. We make span a block element and we see that it stays alone on the line. The inline block value of the display property allows for the placement of block elements next to each other. Here is an example of this, in which we will arrange 3 blocks in one row. The code is as follows, and we will see the following. Almost the same effect can be obtained by using the float property with the value left, which we mentioned in the front end. You can test it out by replacing line 13 of the code display, inline block, with float, left. Let's look at the float property on floated elements. As we understood, in the general, normal flow of the document, all elements are arranged sequentially, with blocks placed one below the other from top to bottom, and inline elements, next to each other from left to right. The float property allows to remove an element from the overall flow of the document and make it float. We can anchor this element to the left or right, depending on the value we set for float. And the mandatory condition for an element to be floated is that it has a specified width. Possible values for float are left, anchors the float to the left, right, anchors the float to the right, none, disables the float property. You may find this property complex and sometimes confusing, because it has some specificities and specifics, so we will explain everything with examples. The float property for floating block elements. Floating block elements are arranged side by side until there is room on the row, then they move to the next row. Here's an example with 4 blocks. This is the code. And here's what we're going to see. We used the example from last time, now we're going to add the outer padding of 50 px again, like in the previous example, and in the browser we will see the following, that is, we see that block 4 goes to the next line because there is no room. The float property when positioning text around an image. Actually, that was the main, most important thing that this feature was invented for. This is its main application, wrapping text around an image. Let's explain this with an example. We'll use the image from the HTML section, which shows the layout of several blocks on the page, and we'll put some text, and the image should be like this. Here's how it will look without the float property, on top the image, and below it the text. This is the normal flow of the document. If we want to include the float property, then we will add the following line in the code, and the result will be this. We see that the text wraps around the image. The result will be similar if we write float right, again, only it will be on the right side. Disabling the float property. Sometimes it is necessary to disable the float property for an element, so that it does not affect its position. In this case, the clear property is used. It specifies on which side of the element floating elements are not allowed. Possible values are left, on the left side, right, on the right side, and both, on both sides. Let's look at an example. We'll use the previous example as a base, but we'll split the text in it into 2 separate paragraphs. Here's the code, and in the browser we'll see the following. Let's say we want this. The second paragraph should not be here like this, but it should be completely below the image. Then we will use the clear property, and for it we will write this, clear, both, and we will get the following result. This is what we wanted to do now. Positioning elements, position property. The positioning of elements determines their location in the HTML page. To specify the exact location, the following properties are used: left, right, top, bottom. These can be used with all position values, except static. The position property specifies the type of the positioning method to be used for a given element. It can take the following values. Static, default value. With static elements follow the usual flow of the layout and are not valid properties, left, right, top, bottom. Absolute. In this case, the element is removed from the general flow of the document and is positioned relative to the browser window or its parent element, which has a position property other than static. Fixed, similar to absolute, with it the element is removed from the general flow and is positioned relative to the browser window, but unlike it, it does not change its location when page scrolling, and can be nested with other elements. Relative, with it, the position is determined by the set values of the left, right, top, bottom properties. Sticky, new property, it switches the element between relative and fixed positioning, depending on page scrolling. Let's look at examples with some of these properties. As a base we will use the example from the previous subsection with the image and text, but in the code we will make the following change. Instead of the line img, float, left, we will put the following code. The whole code is given here, and this is what we will see in the browser. We see that the image has moved according to what we have set. In the second example we will show what will happen when we use fixed instead of absolute positioning. We won't change anything else in the code, except for the following. Instead of position, relative, we'll write position, fixed. And you see what happened, the elements were nested against each other, because the fixed positioning takes this element out of the normal flow and it actually ends up on top of the text. Stacking elements, z-index. Every CSS block, in addition to the x and y axes, can also be positioned along the z-axis. The z-index property is used for this purpose. The diagram shows 3 blocks, which have overlapping positions, and we see that each next one is superimposed on the previous one. The z-index property allows to change the position of a given block along the z-axis, with possible values being auto, default, i.e. follow the normal flow of the document, and integer, where a larger number makes the element appear closer to us, as if it were further down in the document. The z-index property is usually used with the position property, as the position property does not have a static value. Let's look at an example that will be similar to the diagram. The code is next, and in the browser we will see the following. Right here, right, we have put this. Now we will put a z-index of the 3 blocks in the following way. We put them, 3, 2, 1, that is, the first one should be the largest, and hop we see, that the order becomes reversed. The stacking is done in the opposite way. And if we put the largest number on the second element, we will see the following. The second element will overlap the other 2. For elements with the same z-index, the arrangement of the elements follows the normal flow of the document, as if we had not set anything. This property is not inherited by default. That's all for this lesson. Best regards.